Before you watch this video, I just want to apologize. I want to apologize because there's an echo in the video. I didn't set something up correctly with my equipment and didn't realize that was going to create an echo. So hopefully it is bearable enough that you guys could watch this video to the end. If not, I sincerely apologize because there's some great information in this video. I'm here with John Lott. Recently, I did a video on my YouTube channel where I talked about the gun violence archive, pointing out 4 instances in 2024 where there were mass shootings. But when I actually looked into it and started reading the articles, I realized that these weren't actually mass shootings in the traditional sense. Little did I know that John Lott had actually written an article about it, and went into more detail about how these groups like Gun Violence Archive are actually gun control groups and not necessarily objective in the manner in which they present themselves.
Yeah, it's good to talk to you. Yeah, I mean, the Gun Violence Archive, I mean, it's a pretty standard gun control group. About a year and a half ago, it became public that, for example, that they had been lobbying the Centers for Disease Control not to report the rates of defensive gun use up on the website because they argued that it would make it more difficult to go and pass the types of gun control laws that they wanted to get passed. So, it's pretty outrageous that anybody thinks that whether the CDC puts up information should be related to whether or not it helps gun control groups like the Gun Violence Archive pass, the types of regulations they want. The Gun Violence Archive technically says that they define a mass shooting as 4 or more people injured or killed in a shooting. The problem is, one, some of their injuries don't even necessarily include people who got shot. And also, it's not even really just limited to 4 or more. They actually have a case, I believe, from Dallas, for example, that I remember seeing, where just 3 people were injured in the attack. And so there's other definitions that are out there. Usually, the FBI, when they've had mass shootings, it's 4 or more people killed has been the traditional one that's been used.
Yeah.
They've reduced it under the Obama administration to 3 or more people that were killed, but um, it still includes lots of cases that there's a reason why they don't get news attention usually. So, because primarily, the Gun Violence Archive is primarily cases involving drug gangs fighting against each other over drug turf. And most of the rest are like a robbery where multiple people have been shot. Now, are drug gangs fighting against each other over drug turf important? Yeah, sure. Nobody wants anybody to be killed. But they're a lot different than something like Uvalde or the Lewiston, Maine shooting that recently occurred, or other types of attacks. And so the way, so if you look at something like the FBI's active shooting reports, they define active shooting cases as a shooting that occurs in public, not part of some other type of crime like a gang fight over drug turf or a robbery. And for them, they could be anything from one person being shot at and missed all the way up to a mass public shooting, which you could have, many people killed. And so if you combine that with the FBI traditional definition of mass, the way most academics have looked at it is 4 or more people killed in a public place, not involving some other type of crime. And when you look at that, the Gun Violence Archive will go and say that it's like 600 or 650 of these, what they call mass shootings that occur over the year. And what the media, the Democrats, gun control groups constantly use the Gun Violence Archive data. So what will happen is somebody like Biden will go and talk about a school shooting like Uvalde, or the Nashville shooting. And at the same time, they'll say, over the last year, there have been 600 of these shootings. And it's just, the media does it constantly. The media constantly is pointing to some recent case that's gotten a lot of coverage, and then saying that there are 600 of these that are occurring in the course of a year. And again, it's just padding it, because you have shootings that occur all the time in Chicago,
Yeah.
but they don't get national news coverage, each individual one, even though people may talk about the total number of people that got shot over the last weekend. And the reason is that it's just not as newsworthy to have two gang members fighting against each other to control drug turf. Whereas if somebody goes into a mall or a movie theater or a school or a restaurant, a grocery store, and just shooting people, randomly, where the whole point of the attack is simply to go and kill people, that's the type of case that they focus on, and that's kind of what uh, the definition of mass public shooting that I mentioned tries to get at. So they're both important, but what the causes and solutions for those two different types of cases are very, very different.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. I actually think it's a little more insidious in terms of why I don't think they like to speak on the shootings that happen in the inner cities. There's, there's no hiding the fact that the vast majority of our gun violence in this country happens in our inner cities, and in those places, it's predominantly black. And so,
Right.
for the back when I kind of started engaging in my advocacy, I pointed out the fact that when they would talk about shootings, they would only talk about mass shootings, and I said, y'all don't care what goes on as far as the anti-gun side. Y'all don't care what goes on in these inner cities. They're a throwaway to you guys. And over time, I started noticing what they did was, because it became more evident that they weren't focusing on those shootings. It was only the shootings that were happening in places that they were scared could happen to them. And as time has gone on, and you've been doing this longer than I have, but at the time when I kind of started, I noticed it and I pointed it out, and then other people started kind of pointing it out, and noticed that then they started including those numbers in what they call mass shootings now, as a way to kind of bolster those numbers to
That's what
scare, I
the
guess.
Gun Violence Archive, that's exactly what the Gun Violence Archive is doing
Yeah.
by including those types of cases. Look, I mean, you're right. Yeah, 56% of the murders in the United States take place in 2% of the counties. And if you ever look at a murder map, you'll find that about almost two-thirds of those murders occur within 10-block areas within those 2% of the counties. 5% of the counties account for about 76% of the murders. So murders in the United States are extremely heavily concentrated in tiny areas within the country. And it overwhelmingly, directly and indirectly, involves things like gangs fighting against each other over
Yep.
drug turf. And, you know, the Biden administration wants to go and talk about constantly about gun violence. You know, 92% of violent crime in the United States has nothing to do with guns. Okay, nothing at all to go and do with guns. And it's uh, when you have district attorneys who are refusing to prosecute violent criminals, when you have liberal judges over the last few years who have released half or even two-thirds of the inmates from local jails, when you have cuts in police budgets and murder and violent crime increased. It's gone down some now, but it's still not as low as it was before the pandemic. Who do you think the victims of these crimes are? And it's just not the direct victims of violent crime. What happens is that uh, since it occurs in such heavily concentrated areas, who do you think lives in those areas? It's overwhelmingly blacks primarily, and who when stores close, who do you think owns some of those stores? Who do you think works in those stores? Who do you think shops in those stores? Who do you think owns homes in those areas where the crime is occurring? It's overwhelmingly primarily blacks, and their property values, when they get depressed because the higher crime, they're hurt in those ways. So you have to think about the victims of violent crime much more broadly than just the direct victims. And unfortunately, while you have these Soros district attorneys who worry about equity, to make sure that people are convicted across different races at the same rate. uh, you may help out some criminals there, but the people that you're hurting overwhelmingly are blacks, and to a lesser extent Hispanics, because that they're the ones who are suffering from kind of this, not making it difficult for criminals to go and commit crime.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it too stems from the fact that by large, in large part, their policies are what creating these environments where you
Yeah, I
have the
agree.
gang violence and you have the drugs, and so as a result of that, it's almost like they use the violence as a scapegoat, because in a sense of, well, we don't want you to point to the fact that predominantly, even in Republican states, the cities where we have the most gun violence, those cities are ran by Democrats. And
Oh,
so,
they're completely run by Democrats. And as far as policies go, I mean, you look at fatherlessness. Fatherlessness has a huge impact on crime. I mean, you have like 75%, or roughly something like that, of blacks are born out of wedlock now. You know, not having fathers there, people raised in single parent families are not going to do as well in school. They're more likely, young girls are more likely to get pregnant. You're more likely to be involved in crime. Their whole lives are going to be at a much more difficult level than somebody who. I mean, it's hard enough to raise a kid with two parents, let alone with just one parent who's having to work and provide for them at the same time. I mean, uh, they can be heroic and they can do as good of a job as they can. It's just a difficult job to do on your own.
yep. And I think the biggest disservice is the fact that the people who are the leaders in these places understand what's going on. They understand what needs to happen and what needs to take place. But instead, what they do is they talk about it from a 30,000 view and say, "Oh, it's a gun violence issue." But as you pointed out, vast majority of the violence that's taking place there, 92% of it has nothing to do with firearms. So, and in these places, we're not even like they're not even the vast majority of people in these places, in these inner cities, they're not violent people. They're not criminals. So you have a very small
They're
demographic
the
of people.
victims.
Yeah. And
You have
then
a huge amount of crime committed by a very small percentage of people. It's just that where they are, you have the victims in many, many different ways. They're victims, not just the direct victims of crime. Obviously, that's horrible. And obviously, if you're a relative or a friend of somebody that's who's a direct victim, that's horrible too. But they're harmed even if many different ways. They're harmed in terms of their jobs. They're harmed in terms of how much they're worth because their property value. They're harmed in terms of just convenience on where they can go shopping and the cost of things that they have to go and purchase because products are more costly in those areas. Uh, you know, because of insurance and many other costs that they face there if they stay in business. So I mean,
I
they're
guess
harmed in many ways, and it just astounds me that you have so many of these politicians just refuse to even talk or recognize these problems. But you know, as far as the basic problems, I mean, I think the federal government has had a big role in causing things like fatherlessness in the home. You know, in terms of the way the welfare system is set up and how it destroyed the incentives for people to go and stay together. Somebody has to face up to kind of the damage that the government has done to the black family in this country. I mean, you go back
well,
to the 40s and 50s, blacks actually had more stable families than whites did. You know, you had a higher percentage of blacks that were born to two-parent families than you had for whites. But yet, the way the welfare system is set up, it's just destroyed that.
I think a part of it, I think the welfare system has a part to play in it too, but I also think it's part of the culture that the other side, when I say the other side, I'm mainly, and I hate kind of going down this political line of Democrat versus Republican, but I can't deny what I see and what I know. These places are run by Democrats, and
Right.
Democrats have largely pushed a culture which incentivizes a lot of this type of behavior, honestly. And so what you end up happening is you got this little microcosm of people within this other bigger microcosm that is causing a ton of violence. And then as a result of that, they're utilizing those numbers to justify taking away people's rights across the country. While at the
Right.
same time, you have, for instance, that you mentioned, you do have single mothers who live in these environments who are trying to raise kids and doing the right things, and they need to be protected themselves in these environments. But they can't, because the same people who are in positions of leadership who are telling them that all the guns are the issues, well, that woman needs a firearm to be able to protect herself, because
No,
it's not like
I,
the person that you end
I
up
couldn't
locking up, they're going to keep in jail in the first place.
I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, you look the people, if my research convinces me of anything, the people who benefit the most from having guns are the ones who are the most likely victims of violent crime. And that overwhelmingly tends to be poor blacks who live in high crime urban areas. And yet, you look at the different types of gun control laws that make it more costly for people to get it. You look at the way Democrats give out permits. I got a hold of all the concealed carry permits in Los Angeles County from a few years ago. They had like 341 permits that they'd given out to, uh, given that they have a population of like 8 million adults there. And yet, what you find is that the people that they gave the permits to were basically wealthy, white, politically connected individuals. Well, it's fine that those people are able to go and protect themselves, but they're not the ones who are at risk. Only 5% of the permits in Los Angeles County were for blacks. Blacks made up over 10% of the local population. Nationwide, blacks make up about 13% of permit holders, which is very close to their share of the population that's there. And they've been growing at about 200% faster than the growth rate for whites over the last decade. So they've been growing very quickly, and I'm glad to see that. But you look at I'll give you a simple example. You look at two states, Illinois and Indiana. In Illinois, only about 4% of the adult population has a permit. In Indiana, it's over 23%. Why the difference? Well, it's pretty easy. In Illinois, it costs over $400 to go through the process to get a permit with the fees and the training costs. In Indiana, the total cost is $0. Well, but it's not just the number of people who go and get permit or the percent, it's also the composition. In Illinois, it's very heavily permits to wealthy people who live in the suburbs. In Indiana, you see a lot more permits for people who live in low income, heavily minority zip codes. Now, you could have 100% of people having a permit in a wealthy suburb, let's say, where there's no crime. You're not going to get a reduction in crime that's going to occur there. You need to have the people where the crime is having permits. And that's what you see in a place like Indiana. So, you have Democrats completely controlling Illinois. Republicans control Indiana. Democrats claim that they care about the poor and they care about minorities, but yet they set up a system where it's basically only whites who are wealthy who are able to go and get a gun for protection that's there. $400. That's just the cost of going through the process to get a permit. And it makes a huge difference. And you look at things like background checks on private transfers of guns, these so-called universal background checks. In a place like Washington D.C., it costs $125 to do a background check on a private transfer of gun. Almost all the places that have these universal background checks require a separate background check on each gun. So let's say you and I lived in Washington, D.C., or lived in California, one of these other states, and I want to give you 4 guns. Well, you'd think it's just one person giving one other person 4 guns. It should just be one background check because you're getting all 4 of the guns that are there. Give me a benign explanation for why they require a separate background check on each gun when one person's getting them. So in Washington, D.C., if you and I lived there, it would cost $500 for me to transfer the guns to you. There's like no other explanation other than they just want to purposely make it as costly and difficult for somebody to obtain guns. I mean, uh, you know, $125 might not stop me from being able to go and obtain a gun. But a poor person who's exactly the type of person that you were describing a minute ago, $125, that's a real
A lot,
cost to them just
especially if
being
it's on
able to
top of a
obtain a
gun that's
background check.
$400 to $500.
Yeah, I know. And it adds up. And those are just a couple examples of how the system that's set up by gun control people specifically disarms the people who need the protection the most. Police are important. Anybody who's read my academic work knows that I think police are the single most important factor for reducing crime, but the police themselves know that they virtually always arrive on the crime scene after the crimes occurred.
Yeah.
And having a gun, particularly for women, like you were talking about before, who are relatively weaker physically, or the elderly, um, are the ones who benefit the most from having a gun for protection.
Nope, nope, you're absolutely right. But it's not about saving lives. I think for them, it's always going to be about a sense of elitism and control. And it's unfortunate because I think when a lot of people hear control, they kind of just dismiss it, right? Because we live in
Right.
a country that is founded on the ideas of freedom, and we are free, especially compared to a lot of other countries. But I think people undervalue or underestimate how much the anti-gun lobby and the people who push these things actually do want control. They want to control you, and they know that they can't do that if you have a population of people who are armed. And I think there's also a lot of intangible aspects of firearm ownership that I encountered when I started carrying a firearm. Once you start carrying a firearm, you start understanding that you do have the ability to relatively keep yourself safe. And once you start to understand that, what ends up happening is your idea and mindset of relying on the government to keep you safe starts to wane quite a bit.
Right.
And the Democratic Party isn't, is they say it themselves, they are big on big government. And so you can't have a population of people who are no longer feeling like they need to depend on the government to keep themselves safe, because that inherently causes them to lose their power in these places. So I think it's almost to their advantage that, especially within the inner cities, I think it's to their advantage in a lot of ways to make sure that the crime and violence continues there, because then you can always use that and leverage that crime to say, this is why you need us. This is why you need us to pass these laws to try to ban these guns. But oh, we can't do it because those guys over there won't let us do it. And then the cycle continues. And then that literally means they continue to stay in power, rinse, wash, and repeat.
Right. I don't know whether it was 7 or 8 years ago, Texas voted to reduce the fees for concealed carry permits from $140 down to $40.
Yeah.
And, you'd think Democrats should support something like that. And yet, it was basically unanimous among Republicans in support. And I believe it may have been like one or two Democrats voted with the Republicans, but all the rest of the Democrats, I think maybe in the state Senate, all the Democrats voted against reducing the fees. I mean, if you care about poor people being able to go and defend themselves, give me a rational explanation for why, you know, Democrats unanimously or virtually unanimously would vote against reducing the fees for people. We're not even talking about the training part of it or anything,
Yeah.
just the fees for people being able to go and get a permit to be able to carry. And to be honest, I think the constitutional carry debate has just been a continuation of the trend. So, in Texas over time, you see a reduction in the fees, you see reduction in the training costs that are there. It used to be 10 hours to get it and 10 hours to renew.
Yeah.
And then a while ago, they reduced it to 3 to 4 hours for the training. And now with constitutional carry, I mean, you and I would recommend that people go and get training themselves, but but there's no kind of requirement for them to be able to legally carry, that they do a certain amount. And one of the things that you've seen with the constitutional carry is previously politicians just couldn't help but get involved in what would be covered by the training. And often you'd have a lot of useless things that really weren't very helpful for people just because some politician thought they should be included in the class. And so I've actually have data at crimeresearch.org that when states have moved to constitutional carry, you see an increase in the number of people who get training. But the training, I would argue, is probably much more fine tuned to things that people find useful for
Yeah.
being knowing what they need to do in order to be law abiding and not go and break the rules that are there.
No, I absolutely agree with you. And I think to some extent, for people who are kind of in the middle and don't really know, like they hear constitutional carry and they say, why would you want that? And it seems counterintuitive. It's like, oh, so you don't want people to get training. But inevitably what ends up happening is in a weird way, when you remove that barrier, it causes people to freely start exploring the culture of firearms a lot more. And inevitably what ends up happening is you start realizing that, oh, maybe I do need to go get more training. Maybe I do need to learn how to use this firearm safely, because there wasn't this barrier where you felt like you were forced to do something you really didn't want to do, or you have to pay this stupid amount of money. So the incentive to go and then use that money for other things as well, with respect to getting training for firearms, understanding firearm safety, it's no longer there. But when you say, here, you have the ability to protect yourself, you have the right and the ability to go out and buy a gun to protect yourself. They can walk into this world, and then you can educate them the way that we're doing here in this video, the way that people do in gun stores, so forth and so on. And inevitably, nobody wants to accidentally shoot themselves. Nobody wants to be ineffective with the firearm. So naturally, they're gonna want to seek that information. But if you have everything possible, making it as hard as possible for you to do that, you're gonna be less inclined to do that. So you're inevitably creating an environment and a culture of people with firearms who are bad. And I don't mean bad in that their intentions are bad. They're just not good gun owners, because you've made it impossible to be a good gun owner, because you've made it exorbitantly expensive in terms of money and time.
Right. No, I mean, look, I think there's a couple good arguments for constitutional carry. I mean, one of them is you may have a woman who's being stalked or threatened. You look at states, often like the fastest you'll get permits could be 45 days or 60 days. There's some that once you get training, it may be 3 months. You have a couple places like Connecticut where it could be over a year before you go and get your permit. Well, the danger that she may face in terms of a stalker or some other type of threat may be something that she can't even wait a week, let alone 45 days or 60 days to be able to go and protect herself and her family. Uh, the other one is the costs, as you're talking about. And, again, it's the people who are the most vulnerable ones in our society who benefit from having a lower cost that's there. And as you say, you have law abiding citizens who don't want to do something that will get them in trouble. They know that if they use the gun incorrectly, they could unintentionally become a felon. And so they want to know what are the proper ways for them to be able to go and use a gun, and how they can use it. And that's one reason why you see the law abiding citizens going out there and getting the training that they need.
Yeah, I think, and I'll end on this note. I think one way to really understand how disingenuous the other side is with respect to this issue, and even our federal government, is when they come up with these bills, they propose these bills and these policies. Oh, we want to pass this gun control law that is designed to decrease gun violence and keep people safe. Never at any point in any of these bills, there's never money apportioned to educating people on safe firearm ownership. There's never a portion that's dedicated for helping people get training who can't afford to get training. If you genuinely were trying to keep people safe, and you understand you live in a country, you have a country where you do have a Second Amendment right. Okay, cool. You want to have these gun control laws that say you have to go through this background check, you have to this. I don't agree with them. I'm gonna fight them tooth and nail, but at least it would let me know that you have some objectivity if you said it. But at the same time, we're going to make it easier for people to be responsible gun owners by helping them get training, by helping them understand how to own and use a firearm safely. But that's never the case. It's never the case. And so for me, I have a hard time really having the conversation genuinely with the other side, because they're not genuine. They have one goal and one goal only, but they have the high ground in terms of mainstream media and saying, well, we just want reasonable, logical gun laws. No, you don't, because nothing you
Well,
propose is actually making a difference.
right. I know we were mainly going to be talking about the mass public shooting report
Yeah.
that the Crime Prevention Research Center put out, but just on this point, I have to give you an example, and that is look at the background checks. Everybody wants to stop dangerous people from getting guns, but the current background check system is a complete mess, and there's no reason it has to be that. So, for example, Democrats will go and or gun control people will say, look, they're 4 million dangerous or prohibited people that have been stopped from buying guns because of background checks. And that's simply false. What they should say is there have been 4 million initial denials, and something like 99% of those are mistakes. It's one thing to stop a felon from buying a gun. It's another thing to stop somebody simply because they have a roughly phonetically similar name and similar birthday to a felon. And the thing is, the people who are stopped are the most vulnerable people in our society. It's basically black, law-abiding black males and Hispanic males, which are overwhelmingly discriminated against. And the reason is pretty simple. People tend to have names similar to others in their racial groups. Hispanics have names similar to other Hispanics. Blacks tend to have names similar to other blacks. And you have 33% of black males in the United States have felony backgrounds. You have 18% of Hispanic males are felons. You have 6% white males are felons, and 3% of Asian males are felons. And so, where are you more likely to find the mistakes? More likely to find people who, through no fault of their own, law-abiding individuals simply have roughly phonetically similar names and similar birthdays to somebody that you do want to stop. And the thing is, there's no reason those mistakes should be occurring. And I've pointed out for years that gun control people could fix these things. You just mentioned reasonable gun control. I just
Yeah.
want reasonable fixes to the gun control rules that are there. And so, you have if a company, when they do background checks on employees, could you imagine a company looking at roughly phonetically similar names and similar birthdays and doing background checks? If a company did that, they would be sued out of existence under federal law. Well, why not have the federal government meet the same standards for doing background checks that private companies have to meet? And you mentioned the costs. Well, you know, uh, if you want to encourage somebody to do something, you don't tax them. You don't make them pay big fees for doing it. Supposedly, if you want them to go and do the background checks because you think background checks are good and that reduce crime, you know, do you make them pay $125 for doing the background check?
That is a
No.
phenomenal point. That is a phenomenal point.
And so what you do is, if you really believe it, I mean, you're just to give a very similar example to what you just gave with the training, pay for it out of general revenue. And I would argue even more than that, if you if the government does something that benefits certain groups of people, they're the ones who should pay for it. And if gun control advocates believe that background checks reduce crime, it reduces crime for everybody, not just the law-abiding citizens who are going out of their way to go and obey the background check rules. And if everybody benefits, everybody should pay. So again, pay for it out of general revenue. But I've for 25 years, I've told gun control people, if you want to get these universal background checks passed, there are few things that you could do, which I again call reasonable fixes. Get rid of the mistakes. There's no reason the mistakes should be occurring. Pay for it out of general revenue if you really think that it produces the benefits that you claim that it does. And then the third thing would be uh, uh, don't create a national gun registry with
Yeah.
the background checks that are there. And I've told gun control people, I said, look, if you'll write an op-ed piece with me and we agree on these three reasonable fixes there, I'll say fine, get the background checks passed. But I can't get any gun control advocate to agree with me on fixing any of those things. And it's gotten me to believe that, I mean, how can you support a system that has millions of mistakes and are harming the very people who need guns the most for protection?
Yeah.
At that point, I think, you really don't want background checks to reduce crime. You just want background checks in order to prevent people from being able to go and get guns, and particularly prevent uh, blacks and Hispanics and poor people generally from being able to go and protect themselves and their families. I mean, it's very racist
Yeah.
what the gun control people are pushing there, and I and you know somehow we have to get that information out there to embarrass them on this stuff,
Great.
because they're doing real harm.
I absolutely agree. I mean, you made some phenomenal points I hadn't even thought about before, and I'm probably going to end up going back myself and try to figure out how we can push that into the forefront so that people hear and
Well, it's on
understand.
all that stuff's on our website at crimeresearch.org,
Boom.
crimeresearch.org.
Well, there you go.
But
Well, there you have it. Well, thank you very much, Don. I always appreciate you joining me. I love the work you continue to do, and you've always done, even before I've been doing what I was doing. And then I hope you guys continue to do the great work that you guys do over there.
well, you're very important out there getting information out to people, so I appreciate you having me on.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, thank you very much, John.
Thank you.
Guns aren't political. That's why I need your help getting this message to spread on YouTube by clicking the thumbs up button, leaving a comment to let me know what you think of the video, then subscribing to the channel. But most importantly, click that bell symbol. For products featured in this video, click the links in the description.